Silence was a deadly illusion. 6.4 million years ago, before the first human breath, the night was a predator. The scent of fresh blood hung heavy in the humid air of the primal jungle. Guttural screams echoed, not of hunters, but of prey. A shapeless figure, of creaking bones and skin dark as pitch, emerged from the deepest gloom, its incandescent eyes fixed on the form writhing on the ground. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, aware that an ancient, bent, and lethal monster was claiming yet another soul. Something lurked in the shadows, something we should never have disturbed. The air was thick and humid, almost palpable, permeated with the acrid scent of wet earth, the sickening sweetness of organic decomposition, and the dewy freshness of the luxuriant foliage. The primal forest, a dense tangle of gigantic ferns, colossal trees with moss-covered trunks that seemed to reach for the heavens, and vines that twisted like dormant snakes, pulsed with a savage and unforgiving life. It was an unfamiliar sound of an animal being brought down by a saber-toothed cat or a giant crocodile in its usual swamp. A cold, heavy air descended upon them, a cold that did not come from the wind or the night, but emanated from an invisible and malignant source, a presence that seemed to suck the warmth from the environment. Laya began to tremble uncontrollably, her teeth chattering, the cub clinging to her, sobbing softly, sensing its mother's terror and the invisible threat. Kale wielded a thick branch, the only weapon he had, but felt it was useless, like trying to stop a mountain with a bare fist. Whatever was out there, it was not an animal he knew from his daily hunts. It was something more, something that defied comprehension and logic. A pair of incandescent eyes, like dying embers, flickered in the deepest darkness of the forest, before disappearing as quickly as they appeared, leaving only the echo of their residual light on Kale's retina. Kale felt sweat trickle down his back, damp and cold, mixing with the humidity of the air and the sweat of fear. He knew the night would be long, perhaps endless, and that they were not alone in their refuge. He just didn't know if they would survive until dawn, or if they would simply become another victim of the bent being, a name that did not yet exist, but was already etched into the terror of their souls, a legend born of nightmare. There was something desperate and distinctly human about it, a primal panic that settled in the hominids' hearts, making their fur bristle and their muscles tense. Kale felt a shiver run down his spine, throughout his entire vertebral column. "Someone's out there," he grunted, his voice hoarse with apprehension, his eyes sweeping the darkness beyond the campfire's reach, trying to penetrate the nocturnal veil that concealed everything. An oppressive silence followed, breaking the usual rhythm of the nocturnal jungle, a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. Even the insects and the murmuring of water seemed to have ceased their buzzing and dripping. Then, a distinct sound, a dry snap of broken branches and a heavy dragging, made the ground vibrate subtly beneath their feet, like a distant but disturbing tremor. The campfire cast a trembling light on the face of a young female, Laya, who held a cub to her chest, her eyes wide with terror and her mouth agape in a muffled sob. "What is that, Kale?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, almost a whisper of dread that was lost in the air. The scent, once subtle and almost imperceptible, was now unmistakable and overwhelming, that of putrid flesh, mixed with something metallic and sweet, like fresh blood and old, moldy moss, a smell that clung to the throat. Kale knew it was the smell of a predator, but this was different from anything he had ever encountered. Older, more vile, a primitive terror, something their most distant ancestors would have known and feared, but which had never been seen in this era. Sunbeams filtered through the dense leafy canopy drew ephemeral, luminous patterns on the forest floor like ghostly designs, but darkness was the true sovereign here. An oppressive presence that seemed to lurk behind every trunk and leaf, especially as dusk began to paint the sky with shades of purple and blood. The constant sound of dripping moisture and the shrill croaking of prehistoric frogs with a prelude to a much darker and more dangerous nocturnal symphony, a chorus of sounds that warned of unseen dangers. The environment was oppressive, the vegetation so dense it created a claustrophobic sensation, even under the open sky, and the humidity clung to their skin, while the soft soil beneath their feet seemed to swallow them with every step, making escape difficult and movement slow and exhausting. In this ancient setting, a group of primitive hominids, still far from the complexity of Homo sapiens, desperately sought shelter. Their bodies were agile and their instincts sharpened by the daily struggle for survival in a merciless world where every day was a battle. They were dark-furred creatures with prominent jaws and curious eyes, yet filled with an ancient fear, etched into their DNA, a collective memory of unknown perils. Led by Kale, a robust male with scars from countless encounters with predators, a long whitish jagged scar above his left eye, a constant reminder of a saber-toothed leopard that nearly claimed him. They huddled beneath the protection of an overhanging rock, the pungent smell of a rudimentary campfire, attempting to ward off whatever lurked beyond its meager light. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that transformed twisted branches into fleeting monsters on the rock walls, fueling their paranoia. The wind, almost inaudible, brought a cold whisper, a sound that was not of nature, but something more sinister and supernatural, chilling their bones and making the hairs on their necks stand on end. The tension among them was palpable, each clutching at the faint hope the flickering flame offered, their eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Suddenly, a sharp, tearing scream ripped through the air. The scent intensified, suffocating them, and the shadows seemed to stretch and contort of their own accord, gaining monstrous life and forms. The night wore on, dragging slowly, and the air grew increasingly heavy with the invisible presence that surrounded them, an aura of malevolence that seemed to thicken the very oxygen. The scent of decomposition mixed with that of freshly spilled blood, which Kale had smelled before, was now a dense, sickly fog, penetrating every crevice of the rock that sheltered them, suffocating them with its putrid stench. The sounds of the jungle, once a constant cacophony of vibrant life, had transformed into cautious whispers, almost imperceptible, as if the forest itself held its breath in reverence or fear of the creature. Dry leaves crunched under an unusual weight, crushed by an immense force, and the nauseating smell intensified, becoming almost unbearable, making them cough slightly. It seemed to come from above, from the rock face above their heads, a sound that made their stomachs churn. Kale slowly raised his head, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes wide. He barely dared to move, afraid of drawing the being's attention directly to himself, making himself the target. "It's close," Laya hissed, her voice shrill, almost a squeak, her hands clutching the cub even tighter. The campfire flickered, and for a fleeting instant, the pale light revealed something. A gigantic, shapeless shadow with a silhouette that seemed to have emerged from the darkest, most ancient nightmares, swiftly past the cave entrance. It was not an animal with recognizable forms, but rather an aberration, a dark stain against the blackness of the night, which seemed to defy geometry itself and the laws of physics. Its movements were strange, a mixture of heavy slowness and sudden, impossible speed, as if it teleported from one point to another. And then, it vanished again into the darkness, taking with it any semblance of safety they might have felt, leaving only terror. Kale felt the coldness of his fingers gripping the branch, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, a wild, uncontrollable beat that echoed in his ears. He knew that at any moment, that thing could emerge from the shadows and drag them into the darkness. The nightmare was just beginning, and they were the trapped prey, not knowing how much longer they could endure. Then, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noises, for it suggested immediate proximity, an imminent attack. The creature was very close. Kale knew it was there, watching, perhaps even savoring the fear that emanated from them, feeling them as vulnerable prey. He imagined a shapeless, bent creature with disproportionate limbs and a predatory hunting posture, crawling on the ground, its eyes glowing in the darkness like beacons of death, 2 points of malignant, cruel light. A cold thought pierced Cal's mind. This thing did not hunt out of hunger, out of necessity, but for something more sinister. It hunted for the hunt itself, for the terror it inspired, for the anguish of its prey, for the mere pleasure of the chase. Even the insects seemed to have stopped their buzzing, and the croaking of frogs had ceased completely, leaving a sonic vacuum that was more terrifying than any noise. The campfire, now reduced to flickering dying embers with no visible flame, cast long distorted shadows that danced on the wall of the improvised cave, transforming them into ghostly figures that seemed to stretch their arms towards them, wanting to drag them into eternal darkness. The cold that emanated from the forest was not the cold of the night, but a cold that seemed to come from within, a cold of imminent death. Cal stood at the cave's entrance, his body tense, muscles strained to the point of pain and exhaustion. He gripped the thick branch tightly, his knuckles white from the pressure, his rudimentary weapon seeming woefully insufficient. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness of countless nights in the jungle, tried to pierce the veil of night, but it was like staring into a bottomless abyss, an absolute darkness that seemed to suck away all light. He could feel the presence. It was an oppressive, almost physical pressure, making his skin crawl and the hairs on his neck stand on end, a sensation of being watched and evaluated. The other hominids huddled behind him, their eyes wide with terror, some sobbing softly, the fear so palpable it could almost be tasted, like a dense, bitter substance that filled the air. Laya, with the cub huddled in her arms, trembling uncontrollably, whispered, "Cal, what is that?" "I've never felt anything like this. It's different." Her voice trembled and was almost inaudible, and Cal knew that she, like him, felt the abyssal difference between a common predator and that thing, something that defied the natural order itself and the understanding of their primitive minds. Suddenly, a metallic sound and a heavy dragging echoed from outside, as if something enormous and clumsy was moving over a rocky surface, scraping against the stones. A sharp, prolonged creak, like the rubbing of bones on wet, damp rock, echoed from very close by. Night gave way to a pale, misty dawn, painting the treetops in shades of gray and rose, but the beauty was overshadowed by terror. The scent of decomposition had lessened, replaced by the fresh aroma of dew and damp earth. Branches broken abnormally, twisted as if crushed by an immense, unnatural force. The earth churned in an unusual pattern, inconsistent with the footprints of any known predator, but rather of something with a bizarre anatomy. They dragged themselves through the dense forest, their senses on high alert, every shadow seeming to conceal the bent being's curved form, every snapping twig a potential danger. The sky was open, a clear, vibrant blue that stretched to the endless horizon, an immense and welcoming canvas of freedom. The prairie, a sea of tall, golden grass, undulated gently with the breeze, dotted by rocky outcrops and small groups of sparse trees, which offered minimal shade but a visual relief. The air was fresh and clean, without the oppressive, sickly smell of the dense forest. The sound of buzzing insects and chirping birds once again filled the environment, a melody of life that was a welcome sound to their ears, accustomed to the terrifying silence. Cal took a deep breath, feeling a pang of relief that almost made him sway, a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in days, perhaps since the terror began. "Here," he said, his voice stronger, filled with a thread of renewed hope. "Here it's safe." They spotted an imposing rock formation in the center of the prairie, with an elevation that would offer a wide view of the surroundings and a shallow cave that would serve as shelter. It was a place of visibility, where darkness could not easily creep in and where they could see the enemy approaching. For the first time in a long time, hope, fragile as it was, rekindled in their hearts. But Cale couldn't shake a shiver down his spine. Had they truly escaped, or had they merely moved to a new chessboard for the predator, one where it could observe their movements from afar, waiting for the right moment to strike with its calculated cruelty? The vastness of the prairie, which seemed to promise freedom and safety, now also seemed to expose them even more to the sight of something that lurked in the dark. The constant murmur of the wind through the leaves seemed to whisper warnings, and the crack of a branch under a distant animal's feet sent their hearts racing, confusing them and keeping them in constant panic. The fear of being hunted, of being dragged back into the darkness, was a more powerful driving force than hunger or thirst, pushing them forward even when their muscles screamed for rest and their bodies seemed to fail. After hours of exhausting and tense travel, with the sun already high in the sky, they emerged from the forest onto a vast prairie. There was something more grotesque, more deliberate in the disorder, as if the creature had reveled in its destructive passage. The scent, though diminished, persisted, a foul note clinging to the vegetation, a constant reminder of the imminent threat. The idea of remaining in that place, where darkness reigned and the creature seemed to have taken root, was unbearable, a burden too heavy to bear. "We can't stay," Cale grunted, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and terror, the fear still fresh in his throat and in his eyes. Leia nodded, the cub still clinging to her, trembling slightly, her eyes fixed on the darkness from which the creature had emerged, as if it could reappear at any moment. "It will come back," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible, but laden with a terrifying certainty that was almost a prophecy. The decision was unanimous, driven by the instinct for survival. They needed a safe place, a place where the sunlight could fully reach and where shadows were not sovereign, a place that offered some hope of escape or visibility against the invisible hunter. Nevertheless, the air still carried the echo of the previous night's terror, a lingering memory that made them tremble even in the faint morning light, as if the creature's coldness still clung to the atmosphere. The hominids, exhausted and traumatized, emerged from their precarious refuge, their bodies stiff and aching, every movement a torture. Their faces were etched with fear, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and the incessant dread that consumed them. The silence of the dawn was disturbing, a stark contrast to the usual sounds of the forest that should have resumed their vibrant rhythm. Even the birds seemed to hesitate to sing, as if the environment was still under the spell of the malignant presence that had hovered over them. Cale observed the trail the being had left, every detail confirming its monstrous nature. The journey was arduous and fraught with apprehension, every step an act of courage. The contrast was shocking and almost dazzling, a balm for their eyes and souls. The prairie offered an apparent refuge, but peace was an illusion, a thin layer over an abyss of terror. The days were filled with constant vigilance, their eyes scanning the horizon, searching for any anomaly in the tall grass, any movement that wasn't of the wind or familiar animals. The sun, once a symbol of safety and warmth, now merely highlighted the vastness of the open space, which, paradoxically, also left them exposed and vulnerable, without the protection of the forest's dense foliage. It was not a frontal, direct attack, but a series of events orchestrated with subtle and calculated cruelty, as if the creature was toying with them. It wasn't the clumsy silhouette he had imagined, but something slender and impossibly swift, a moving blur in the dark, almost imperceptible. One of the young hominids, a male named Barrow, had ventured a little beyond the campfire to gather firewood, driven by the desperate need for more warmth, ignoring Cal's warnings. He was returning, his arms full of kindling, when a sharp, hissing sound ripped through the air, a sound that chilled Cal's blood and made Barrow stop, paralyzed by terror, the kindling falling from his hands. Cal shouted, "Come back, Barrow!" Now, but it was too late. The shadow emerged from the grass, and for a brief, terrifying instant, Cal glimpsed the creature in its full, horrid glory. It was tall, with long, thin limbs and a body contorted into an impossible posture, as if its bones had been broken and reformed into an abomination. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light in the dark, 2 points of pure, irrational hatred, without any spark of life. The creature lunged at Burrow with terrifying speed, and the young male's scream was abruptly cut short, turning into a gurgle of blood. The sound of bones cracking and flesh tearing echoed in the silent night, and the shadow vanished as quickly as it appeared, dragging Burrow into the depths of the prairie's darkness, leaving no trace. Cale felt his blood run cold in his veins, terror completely paralyzing him. The horror was indescribable, the helplessness overwhelming. There was nothing he could have done. The creature was hunting them, one by one, systematically, and the prairie, once a refuge, had become their trap, an open-air graveyard where each one awaited their turn. First, it was the hunting. The animals that once grazed freely on the prairie, the agile deer and wild buffalo, disappeared without a trace, as if they had been swept from the face of the earth. The silence of the game was more terrifying than any predator's roar, for it meant there was no longer any food source, and hunger would soon become a new enemy. Then, the tracks. Deformed footprints, impossibly large and distorted, appeared around the grotto, always at night, always disappearing by dawn, as if they were the materialization of a nightmare that materialized and dematerialized at will. They were not from an animal, but from something that walked on 4 limbs, but in an inhuman, bent way, as if its bones were made of rubber and metal. The campfire, no matter how hard they tried to keep it burning and fed, seemed to diminish the flame, struggling to stay alive, as if the air around it sucked away. The warmth and light, a supernatural coldness radiating from the creature's presence. The stench of decay became omnipresent, a suffocating cloud that clung to their clothes and skin, impossible to ignore. With each twilight, primal fear returned, an icy chill permeating the atmosphere, denser than the nocturnal dew, carrying an invisible weight. The scent, the same nauseating smell of putrid flesh and moss, lurked in moments of distraction, carried by a treacherous breeze, a current of air that seemed to come from hell itself. It was a constant reminder that, even in daylight, the bent being was not far, merely lurking, invisible, yet present, observing them from its own darkness. They set up their base in a shallow grotto on the rocky slope, an elevated point that offered a panoramic view of the prairie, but which was also a potential trap. The campfire was kept burning day and night, a small beacon of warmth and light against the immensity of the darkness that surrounded them. But the warmth was scarce and the light weak, unable to ward off the true terror. But the fire could not dissipate the terror that nested in their hearts, a deep and paralyzing fear. No one dared to stray from the group's safety, not even to hunt or gather fruit, for they knew that death lurked beyond the circle of light. Hunger, though present and gnawing at their stomachs, was suppressed by the fear of becoming the next prey, the next victim to be dragged into the darkness. Laya, paler and thinner each day, with deep circles under her eyes, looked at the cub with visible anguish in her eyes, knowing that their chances of survival dwindled with each sunset, with each passing minute. "Cale, it's hunting us. It knows where we are," she whispered one night, as the wind howled outside like a mournful lament, her voice choked with despair. Her eyes were filled with silent, profound terror. Cale merely clenched his jaw, speechless, impotence suffocating him. He felt the same thing, the sensation of being trapped prey, with no escape. The bent being's vengeance was swift, a cruel and methodical retaliation. One night, as Cale stood guard, his eyes red and heavy with fatigue, a shadow moved in the tall grass, faster and more fluid than anything he had ever seen. Boar's brutal death cast an even deeper, denser shadow over the group, crushing any lingering hope. Fear, once a constant, nagging whisper, was now a deafening scream in their hearts and minds, reverberating in every nerve. The hominids huddled in the grotto, barely daring to look at each other. The image of the attack vivid in their minds, a nightmare that repeated itself incessantly. The silence, which had once felt like a momentary relief, was now a sinister omen, for the creature moved without a sound, like a phantom of the shadows, impossible to detect until it was too late. The acrid scent of the bent being, which seemed to hang everywhere, grew denser, almost visible, a foul mist announcing its imminent arrival. It was a scent of warning, of proximity, as if the creature was announcing its presence and its intention. Kale knew the creature was watching them, sensing the shift in their energy, the determination that replaced their paralyzing fear. He prepared for the final confrontation, the most important of their lives. He sharpened the tip of a thick branch with a stone, feeling the weight of the weapon in his hands, sweat trickling down his arms, mixed with the sweat of fear. "Everyone in position," he said, his voice stronger than he expected, echoing the new determination they shared. The hominids spread out, some gripping stones tightly, others with sharpened branches, their hearts pounding, but with a new purpose. They would no longer be mere prey. The battle would be uneven, they knew, but they would no longer be helpless victims. The approaching night would be the longest of their lives, but also the night they would decide their own destiny, the destiny of their species. The plan, however desperate, was their only hope of surviving the shadow hunter. The scent of decomposition was constant, a foul cloud that hung over them, a persistent reminder of the predator that surrounded them, invading their lungs and their souls, suffocating them. Hunger and exhaustion added to the terror, transforming them into mere shells of themselves, skeletal bodies and empty, lifeless eyes. Laya, with the cub trembling in her arms, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, looked at Kale with desperate determination in her gaze, a spark of fire amidst the darkness that consumed them. "We can't run anymore," she said, her voice hoarse, yet incredibly firm, echoing in the small grotto, cutting through the heavy silence. But to fight, to have a chance, however small, to strike back. The prairie, once seen as an open field of exposure and vulnerability, was now a potential arsenal if they knew how to use it against the enemy. Kale, with the help of some younger males, who had found a new sense of purpose in their despair, began to collect sharp stones, chipping them with other rocks, creating cutting edges and deadly points. They gathered sharp branches and sturdy vines, twisting them to create primitive but effective snares and traps. They dug rudimentary traps, deep and disguised pits covered with leaves and branches, skillfully camouflaging them to deceive the creature, and armed the perimeter of the grotto with sharp stakes, like a monster's teeth, facing outwards. The sound of their work, the clink of stones, the rustle of leaves, was a strange noise amidst the tense and terrifying silence that had dominated the prairie, a sound of life and resistance. Laya, with her agility and an instinctive knowledge of the terrain, explored the grotto, searching for fissures or passages that could serve as an escape route or an ambush point. She found a small crack at the back of the grotto, a narrow tunnel that led to the other side of the rocky slope. It wasn't an easy path. It would require contortions and effort, but it was a path, an escape route, a chance for life, a light at the end of the tunnel. "We have to fight." The idea seemed insane, a proposition of suicide, of certain annihilation. How could they fight against a creature so fast, so strong, so unexplainable, that seemed to defy the laws of nature and physics? But the alternative was a slow, certain death, passively waiting for annihilation. Despair gave way to a thin thread of courage, a flame that threatened to extinguish at any moment, but which persisted. Kale, though fearing the imminent battle with every fiber of his being, knew Laya was right. "How?" He grunted, his voice heavy with skepticism and weariness, but with a trace of renewed hope, a small spark of possibility. They spent the next day in a frenetic search for resources, not to survive another miserable night. As they worked, their bodies exhausted and their minds overwhelmed. The sun began to set, and the sky turned to shades of orange and purple, a beautiful yet menacing harbinger of the approaching night. The night arrived, relentless and dark, bringing with it the penetrating cold and the dense, nauseating stench that announced the bent being's presence. The moon, a thin, pale sliver in the sky, offered little light, and the stars seemed distant and indifferent, unable to pierce the veil of terror that enveloped the prairie. The bent being, however, was faster and more resilient than any of them could have imagined. It climbed out of the pit with unnatural agility, its movements impossible for a creature of its size. The air outside was fresh and clean, and they emerged to a sight of the sunrise more beautiful than they had ever seen, a rebirth into the world, into life. The sky turned orange and pink, and the warmth of the sun began to dissipate the night's cold, bringing a sense of safety. They were safe, for now. The victory was temporary, but it was a victory. But as Kale looked back at the prairie they had just left, he did not see the bent being. There was no trace of it, only trampled grass and the residual smell of its horror, a memory that would never fade from their minds. The creature had disappeared again, perhaps to heal, perhaps to plan its next appearance in another era, for another species, another time. Relief mixed with a pang of uncertainty and a primal fear that would accompany them forever. They had survived the confrontation, but the shadow of the bent being would remain in their memories, a reminder that not all predators of darkness existed only in nightmares. Perhaps, in future ages, when humankind rose and looked to the stars, this creature would still lurk in the depths of the past, a dark echo of a forgotten time, waiting for the moment to claim its vengeance. And who knows, perhaps the legend of the bent being is what makes us fear the dark to this day, an ancestral fear passed down from generation to generation, a memory of something that crawled before us. And its long, twisted limbs whipped out, striking one of the males, who fell lifeless, his neck broken at a grotesque angle. The scent of blood spread in the air, but this time, it was hominid blood, the metallic, sweet odor of death mixing with the foul stench of the being, creating a nauseating blend. The battle was chaotic, a whirlwind of cries of pain and despair, sounds of stones impacting flesh, and the horrific creaking of the creature's bones, a sound that seemed to echo from the very earth from the depths of the past. Laia, pushing the cub into the grotto's crack with unspeakable maternal desperation, threw a stone with all her might, aiming for the source of light. The stone struck one of the creature's incandescent eyes. The bent being let out a sharp, shrill shriek and recoiled for an instant, its movements becoming more erratic, its body swaying as if disoriented. The wind, once a gentle whisper, now howled like a funeral lament. Carrying the sounds of the prairie, he advanced, driven by desperate fury and an overwhelming love for his group, for his species, for the future. To the crack! Retreat to the crack! He shouted, his voice hoarse, yet firm and authoritative. The other hominids, wounded and exhausted, began to move towards the narrow tunnel Laia had discovered, crawling to safety, their last strengths being used to escape. The bent being with its wounded eye seemed to falter, but its fury intensified, transforming its pain into an even deeper hatred, a desire for annihilation. It lunged again, aiming for Kale, the last obstacle in its path. The primitive male raised his branch, and, with a battle cry that came from the depths of his soul, he pierced the creature's dark, leathery skin, finding a point of weakness. A black, foul liquid gushed from the wound, and the bent being roared, a sound that made the ground tremble beneath their feet, a roar of pain and rage. The creature recoiled, its movements now slower, the glow in its eyes diminishing, like a dying ember. Kale didn't wait. He knew the creature was wounded, but not dead, only temporarily incapacitated. "Run!" he roared, pushing the last of the hominids into the crack, before turning and crawling in himself, exhausted but alive. but muffling any noise the creature might make, rendering it even more treacherous and invisible. The hominids were in their positions, muscles tense, bodies rigid with apprehension, their hearts beating a frantic, irregular rhythm in their chests. Fear was still present, a knot in their throats that made breathing difficult. But there was something more. A spark of defiance, a refusal to be mere victims, a fierce determination to fight for life, for their lineage. Kale positioned himself at the grotto's entrance, his sharpened branch raised, his eyes fixed on the darkness, awaiting the inevitable, the moment of confrontation. The attack came unexpectedly and brutally, a burst of terror that ripped through the night. It wasn't the sound of heavy footsteps they expected, but a sharp, almost inaudible hiss, followed by an incredibly swift movement in the tall grass, a rustle of leaves that seemed to come from all sides surrounding them. The shadow, more slender and ghostly than Kale had glimpsed before, burst forth suddenly, its sharp, pointed claws gleaming faintly in the dim light, like freshly forged obsidian blades. The bent being did not seem to have a solid body, but a twisted mass of bones and muscles with skin that absorbed light, making it almost invisible in the dark, an apparition from a nightmare that should not exist. Its eyes, like incandescent embers, were the only thing betraying its presence. 2 points of pure, irrational hatred in the blackness. It lunged at the first trap, falling into one of the pits they had dug. A bestial roar, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality and make the universe tremble, echoed not of pain, but of a primal and ancient fury, a rage that came from forgotten ages, from the very foundation of the earth. The roar was the signal. The hominids launched themselves, attacking with sharp stones and pointed branches, a battle cry mixed with despair and the need to survive. Kale saw his chance, a ray of hope amidst the chaos and despair. They crawled through the dark, tight tunnel, the smell of ozone and damp earth replacing the stench of decay and blood, a relief for their senses.